We have people logging on from all over today. This is lovely. Well, welcome, welcome, and welcome. We're so grateful that you are joining us today for this webinar with Reverend Dr. Velda Love. I realize since we're from all over the world, I thought just the country, but we are all over the world, that you might be at the end of your day, or maybe just the end of your morning, or maybe at the beginning of your day. But any place that you're at, you can take a breath and think about the things that you have thought or felt thus far today. Let's take that breath. And maybe you've decided that you need to stretch a little bit before you sit for this webinar. Maybe you need to dance. No one can see you. Go for it. Or maybe you just need to wiggle a little bit. But do what you need to do in this space. And then settle in, possibly at the edge of your seat for our speaker. MCC is honored and delighted to have Reverend Dr. Velda Love with us today. Reverend Dr. Love is the Racial Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. Dr. Love's work centers on addressing historical and contemporary injustices resulting from systematic, structural, and individual racism. She develops and leads trainings and workshops on reparatory racial justice, including the UCC Join the Movement Towards Racial Justice campaign. In an article, The Wait is Over, published last year, Dr. Love wrote, "Becoming an anti-racist is a lifelong journey. It happens in community with other committed people who journey together and commit to decentering whiteness, leaning into practices to decolonize socialized patterns of thinking and behaviors. The process includes relearning history, correcting false narratives, and working towards racial shifts in policies and structures that harm Black lives." Thank you, Dr. Love, for being a part of our journey today. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you for all of you who have been part of the planning team. This is an exciting opportunity to be with you, and I am thrilled that we have this opportunity so that it is also a space for us to learn together. I want to thank Krista, especially. She is part of this very rich legacy of spiritual direction, and having gone to North Park University at Theological Seminary, and also having graduated from there, as well as spending my life in Chicago. I love the space of being in Chicago. I am now in Cleveland, Ohio, at the national setting of the United Church of Christ. And so it's an honor to be with you this afternoon. This is an opportunity for us to lean into the work that I have been doing around African-centered pedagogy. It is both a historical look as to how we have been impacted by racism. It speaks to our contemporary times. Spending last week immersed in the end of the trial for Ahmaud Arbery, we saw a measure of justice as the three white men who attacked him, murdered him, and then they were not arrested right away, spoke to this lingering historical violence on Black bodies. And then as I sat with clergy from the United Church of Christ and we waited for the verdict of the Charlottesville trial, we also felt a measure of justice being enacted. And our own Seth Wispaway, Reverend Seth Wispaway, who called for clergy to come to Charlottesville so that we could also have an opportunity to lean into pushing back against white supremacy and right-wing supremacy as well. And so we're here today to take a look back in order to develop strategies on how we move forward on anti-Black racism and for people of African descent. I name myself that way because my ancestors from my DNA test are from Nigeria. 99.4% Yoruba and Hausa from the Nigerian people. That is on my matrilineal side. It allows me to know that 500 to 2,000 years of people from Nigeria, in addition to having Middle Eastern, Asian, Native American, and European ancestry in my DNA on my matrilineal side, but that is only 4.6%. So I claim this African identity in a way that allows the conversation to be about the African diaspora. And as we lean into the UN decade for people of African descent, it also allows the church to have a better understanding of both the journey of people of African descent, their intent, God's intent for them to be free people, and the way that settler colonialism has benefited from both its policies and demonizing people of African descent. This afternoon, we're going to spend some time basically looking at both our history and how we move forward. But I'd like to also let you know that this is an interactive opportunity. And so I'm going to share my screen with you, and then we'll begin. And so we are going to be leaning into radical faith. And what does it mean to dismantle racism in the Christian church? It's a process in which we begin to learn new language, as well as how we self-identify. I start from this space because we are people of faith. And this reminds me that God created everything that exists for those who have an understanding of a God that created long before humans were even thought of. And the beauty of our day, however you spend it, can be focused on this great creation and the intentionality that the God we serve, the spaces in which we are living and breathing and walking and working, belongs to God. If we start from that premise, we have a better understanding of who we are as a human family, the ways in which God intended. I'd like for us to just center ourselves and spend a few moments just having a devotion. And this is a really important part of how we leave a legacy when we listen to children. It's not going to work. And that is the beauty of technology. So I'm going to share a different screen. There we are. I encourage you to plant your feet, to open your mind, to suspend judgment, and to journey with the words of a child.
O midwife of spring, come and cause what needs to be born in us. Draw us out of winter's nurturing womb. Teach us to believe in our unopened buds. Accompany us into a world starved for a new life. O seed buried in the soil, come, die to your seed-like condition. Break through the darkness that had cradled your life. Pierce the hard husk of all that we cling to, or just listen to the quiet sound of growing. Oh, hidden life, now unveiled. Come welcome guest. Set free our reluctance to live fully and deeply. Awaken us to the beauty that holds and enfolds us. Open our eyes to all we can become. Oh, spring, rising out of winter's arms, come, melt what is frozen in us. Open the buds of our longing with your gentle breeze. Soften the heart of our hearts with your rains. Breathe warmth upon the cold places in us. O green mantle of creation, come. Clothe us with colors of spring. Paint our fields and forests with your artist's brush. Leap into our lives with our lover's enthusiasm. Fill us with boundless energy and faithful hearts. O child of resurrection, come. Come dancing out of winter's gloom. Enliven us with your radiant hope. Lure us through the closed doors of our doubt. Celebrate with us the wonder of risen life. O laughter of the earth, come. Laugh us out of our rigidity. Lightened hearts grown weary with anxiety. Send us out to the meadows to play like a child. Rise up in our souls with light-hearted joy. O awakening dawn, come. Come like the day star rising out of the east. Come bearing the sparkling rays of your substance. Come carrying baskets of flowers and green laced leaves. Call forest blossoms sleeping in the garden of our lives.
As you listened to that young child speak, I hope that opened your heart, because we should encourage one another to come to our faith journeys as children. We were once children, but we often forget because of so much chaos in the world that we should play, that we should find joy, that we should be hopeful in the midst of what looks like chaos, injustice, racism, sexism, and all of the intersections of our lives. And so I hope that you can sit with that, to hear, to listen, to remember. And even if your childhood was not as playful or as joyful, that if you have children or that you know others that have them, think about the legacy that we leave for them, the kind of world that we leave for them, and the way that we are creating policy today, the way that we are talking about cultural identities today, and the ways in which we lean into more truths than myths. Now journey with me as we begin to have an opportunity to look more deeply at who we are as God's people. And so I begin in this space that God loves the world. And when I talk about God, I'm talking about the God, the Spirit, the Ruach that moved over the face of the waters, that the creation of the earth was made in darkness, and that the intentionality of God loving the world means that we change the way we see one another as a human family. And it begins with removing the stigma, the stereotype, and the myth that there are dominant people or superior people groups. God did not create dominant people, superior people groups, dominant cultures or languages or histories. We are all chosen. And so we lean into a particular story written by a particular people in a particular time. But if we see ourselves as a family, as a human family, we know that we are because God is. And so our learning today is inclusive of how did we get here. My work is looking at pre-human history and pre-colonial history so that we can reconstruct humanity. And the question that I always ask, whether I'm teaching or doing workshops, who are our ancestors? That means, where did your ancestors originate? Because this continent within the United States and North America belonged to indigenous peoples. And until we unpack the truth of the stewardship of the land that belonged to the native North Americans, then we live in a myth as if America belongs to settler colonialists. The question, where did they originate, means on what continent, and why did they leave if they moved into the North American territory? When did they arrive? People of African ancestry have perhaps a more challenging space in which to talk about their ancestry, unless they've done their DNA. But how do we reclaim land when Native Americans can talk about the land that they stewarded that was stolen from them, and then how they were removed from the land? But when did your ancestors, if you are of European descent, and that is the reconstruction of language, people of Asian, African, European, Native, and Latin descent. And so the question, when did they arrive, if you are a person of European descent or even Asian descent? Those questions are important because it is important to also ask the question, how did they arrive? My ancestors, as I traced my own lineage, were enslaved. Free people on the continent of Africa were enslaved. And so we'll talk, and I'll talk more about that arrival into North America, into the colonized states. The learning agenda also means that we have to restore identities, that people have the space and they have the right to identify themselves without being colored or raced, because race is a myth and a construction. And we want to be clear about who we belong to and how we belong to a particular people group. So we get to self-identify. And then as a human family, as people part of the kingdom of God and siblings in faith, we have to be conscious of reconstructing our language. And when I talk about reconstruction, when I self-identify, because my identity is restored, it is not based on someone else's definition of who they think I am, then I can also talk about being a woman of African descent, created in the image and likeness of God, breathed on by the Holy Spirit. And when I speak of that, that allows me also to correct those who would want to label people of African descent as minorities. That may be part of the population, because we are 13% of the population in the United States, but that label was constructed to hold space because we were seen as inferior people, not human. And then the 3/5. We'll talk more about that. And so reconstructing language means that if we are siblings in faith and belong to the kingdom of God, and we are part of the human family, we are no longer viewing and labeling and pigeonholing people in a way in which the constructed narrative was supposed to have an hierarchical impact. And it has an impact. And so someone might say, what does this have to do with me? I didn't own slaves. I didn't create the laws. All of this has everything to do with us, because this moment is about truth telling in the 21st century. I believe in the word Sankofa, the Akan word, those West African peoples who were intent on speaking into their descendants as well as looking back at their ancestors and protecting those who were to come, that all of the history belongs to us. But if we're going to tell the truth, we have to go back and get it. Go back and get it. And so these words mean something, and I would encourage you to lean into what does it mean that we are living with colonialism, settler colonialism, those Europeans, those Puritans, and those pilgrims that came, that claimed the land and removed the indigenous, that created government and policies, that created genocide, that held on to a belief, created a narrative, a myth around people of African descent. Colonialism. It impacts our educational system, our political system, our church communities, and the very ways in which I believe you have leaned into the doctrine of discovery. The church created that document. The church sanctioned the removal of indigenous and African people. The church sanctified and sanctioned genocide. The church, for the wealth of nations, Europe and Spain and the monarchy. And how does that translate today? We have to lean into this term of white privilege and the ideology of supremacy. It is an ideal that we are living with white supremacy, anti-racism, microaggressions, and cultural education, the pushback on critical race theory. It's not really about critical race theory. It is about teaching cultural history for those who want to hold on to white privilege and an ideology of supremacy, and using militarism and capitalism in order to push back. And so part of all of the work is around how we resist as people of faith. That is not a new term. Resistance came about with the first century church. The church was a movement. Those who claimed to follow the Jewish Jesus, who created a New Testament, and those New Testament people gathered in small community to teach the teachings of the rabbi. I called him a theologian, a teacher of how we live differently, how we move differently, resist the empire, and resist the narratives that people are less than. And how do we, as a community of faith, Christians, I self-identify. If you self-identify as a Christian, then how do we address injustice? How do we know both how the Supreme Court has codified and solidified laws still written on books around gentrification, removing people from communities? How do we address injustices, incarcerating innocent people? How do we address injustice when those who commit terrorism and torture against people of African descent get to go free? How do we address it? Our lives and our lived experiences matter, and we have to tell our stories. No one gets to tell the story. The conqueror does not get to tell the story of people who have been conquered. Our lived experiences matter. We have to lean into why voting rights are being pushed back, and civil and human rights and immigration and environmental justice is important. And so humans are not the center of creation. The earth, this rock we live on, this text for me, Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's, everything in it, on it, and the world and all who live on it. Because this rock is 4.5 billion years old. 4.5, and the stages of the evolution of the earth did not have people on it 4.5 billion years ago. We are about 200,000 years old as a human species. Let's lean into that. Let's talk about, look at, and then reimagine how we begin to use the language of human family through the evolution of humanity. This video is important because it allows us to lean into, again, how we change the narrative, how we understand the cradle of civilization that started on the continent of Africa, its first people, and how they circumnavigated the globe, leaving their DNA everywhere they went, intermingling with another part of human creation. And so that is helpful for us, again, to recognize God's intentionality about First Peoples. I want to move us to this video.
Not just the content, it's beyond.
How are you doing, girl?
I'm Henry Louis Gates Jr., and I'm the executive producer and host of Africa's Great Civilizations. I've studied and taught African literature, but I've learned so much more making this series.
The fossil evidence and the archaeological evidence that's come to light in the last 20 or 30 years is very, very substantial.
Maybe as much as 3/4 of what's in this film I didn't know 5 years ago. This is stunning, stunningly beautiful.
It is, it is.
We've been taught to think of Africa as static, isolated, frozen in time, no development. There were trade networks all over Africa, refuting this myth that these people were waiting on Stanley and Livingston to show up and discover them.
If you look at this map, it's right at the center of a nexus of trade routes that link it right across the continent. But it's not just the continent, it's beyond.
Africa was always in contact with the rest of the world. This is one of the big surprises.
Throughout most of the Middle Ages, Europe was on the gold standard, and without African gold, the whole currency of Europe basically would fall.
This was someone who had influence not just within Africa, but beyond. And it's a fantastically wealthy kingdom.
Mansa Musa was the world's richest human being ever, worth $400 billion.
This is what people don't know about Africa, is that there were these amazing cities that were effervescent. People were writing, creating things, doing innovations in law, in trade.
Africans were as complex and as interesting and brilliant as everybody else in the history of the world.
Dr. Henry Louis Gates is one of my favorite historians, and I love cultural historians, but I also enjoy the ways in which cultural historians, archaeologists, and scientists have done their work. And so the question I ask my students when I'm teaching or conducting workshops is, what didn't you learn in your formative years of education? Why wasn't this taught more in formal education in schools? And so again, some of you may have gotten this in college, this rich history of Africans. And so it's an invitation to be on a journey, to undo the myths, to listen to the richness, the vastness. The continent is not monolithic with people. It is multi-ethnic, multicultural, over 3,000 languages and people groups. And so we have to be conscious of the way that we learn and lean into this work as people of faith, because the birth of Christianity is born in the northeast corner of the African continent. This is long before maps were drawn by Europeans. And so we have to do that hard work if we're going to change the narrative and be about the truth telling. And so modern humans, again, are about 200,000 years years old, and this comprises the world population in this moment. The largest population is Asian cultures, 5.2 billion people. 54% of the world population is Asian, and Africa is 25.6%, and Latin America and the Caribbean peoples of the world are 7.8%, which means that 87.7% of the world's population are people of color, not European. People of color. And so when we begin to think about, again, the resurgence of white supremacy, the resurgence of white nationalism, and the resurgence and the pushback on people of African descent globally, the diaspora, we have to take into account, again, those who control the wealth and the narrative, because people of European descent are only 7.3% of the world's population. And so what does that mean in this moment as we're listening to debates about world population and the changing demographics? It is worth going back to get some history in order to address the contemporary injustices around racism. Again, it's an invitation. And so I love to show this picture because it allows us to see the very richness of the kingdom of God, the intentionality and the beauty of people from diverse cultures and languages and even beliefs, because there's more than one way to get to a God that created humanity. And so we want to dig in and lean into this origin of race, the origin of race.
evolution of race.
Oops, sorry.
Did you know that race was not always considered a biological or genetic category? So how did we come to understand it that way today? We all have a working definition of race. Whether you kind of understand it, hate it, claim not to see it, or study it, hint, hint, cough, cough, that's me, it still plays a role in all of our daily lives. From the way that people interact to the places they live and stereotypes they face, race is still a determining factor in our social structures, both inside and outside of the US. But full disclosure, I do a lot of US history, so this is a US specific video about race, since these histories operate differently across various contexts. Okay, so let's get started by asking, what were some of the earliest definitions of race? Well, before we started thinking of race along the lines of biology, genetics, or phenotype, aka physical appearance, did you know that it was largely considered a category of kinship or group affiliation? In the 16th century, we started to see the use of the word race in English, but it isn't attributed to physical traits or behavior. It meant quite literally that you were all members of the same household, group, or shared a common ancestor. But when did race shift to being less about kinship groups to sounding more complicated than the lyrics to I'm My Own Grandpa? Well, we can see that starting in the colonial era. And that brings us to our second question. Why did we see the shift in the idea of race in the 17th and 18th century? The answer to this question is firmly rooted in two things: the rise of global capitalism that was backed by slavery and colonialism, and a period of theorizations in Europe known as the Enlightenment. When the Spanish began the colonization of the Caribbean and later Latin America after 1492, they looked to native populations to mine silver and gold under brutal working conditions. They set about enslaving, attacking, and murdering those who didn't comply. Thousands of native people died as a result of overwork, genocide, or because they were exposed to new diseases brought over with the Spanish settlers. And when England established its first successful long-term colonies in North America in Virginia in 1607, they looked to mirror this pattern of enslavement with native people, while also seeking copious amounts of silver and gold. But they had limited success with this route because, one, Virginia wasn't exactly rich in gold, and two, native populations were able to resist the efforts of early settlers through fighting back or escaping and blending into adjacent native groups. English settlers still wanted to make money off of this venture, so they began to look to alternative ways of making Virginia profitable, and that came in the form of tobacco. But a major problem with growing tobacco is that it requires a ton of labor, and the laborers needed the agricultural skills to turn the crop into cash. Because they had already met with sustained resistance from native populations, English settlers looked to other potential labor sources: enslaved Africans and indentured British laborers. There are some important distinctions to make between these two groups. First, indenture was a contractual agreement with fixed terms that varied widely. Some indentured servants were brought to the colonies against their will, either as a punishment or because they were children. Terms of these contracts were often very exploitative, but many came willingly in exchange for their passage to the new colonies, and many of these indentured servants finished the terms of their contracts and began lives as property owners. Enslavement of Africans was an entirely different category of labor from indenture, because one, slavery was for life, not for a fixed term or a number of years. Two, slaves were not considered human. Three, it was not a contract because it takes two consenting humans to enter into a contract. And four, slave laws were enacted codifying hereditary slavery, meaning that if you were enslaved and had children, then those children would also remain in slavery. With the expansion of this system, there was understandably some resistance, even from Europeans. So in order to continue to justify slavery, we start to see the pseudoscience of race emerge that connected physical features, behavior, and legal rights right around the 18th century when colonial use of slaves was expanding. Anthropologist Audrey Smedley notes that scientific scientific ideas about physical appearance and racial difference in the 18th century were largely folk ideas used to justify already existent social norms. So as a result of a desire to perpetuate systems of exploitation, more and more distinctions were made about the supposed differences amongst races, primarily the differences of Black people from their white counterparts. This evolution of race became more concretized after social structures of slavery were in place, and not before, and was solidified by the Enlightenment. Which brings us to our third question. How did the Enlightenment impact definitions of race? The Enlightenment was a period of primarily European thought and ideological development that saw the emergence of some key concepts that tie back into today's discussion. First, there was a push in scientific communities to categorize the natural world using reason and creating elaborate hierarchical systems that emphasize the similarities between different species and subgroups and the inherent differences amongst others, and race was fitted into this same mold. As European theorists looked to classify the world into scientific groupings, physical markers that were already established social norms through enslavement and genocide were ways that they sought to prove that this was the natural order and not a social construction. For example, Thomas Jefferson, who was a proponent of concepts like individual liberty and freedom for white men, or those he considered his peers, also made claims that Black slaves required less sleep than their European counterparts to justify excruciatingly long and inhumane work hours. And Samuel Cartwright, who falsely claimed that drapetomania was a mental defect that caused enslaved Black people to run away from slavery, as if wanting to escape a lifetime of enslavement was illogical. The Enlightenment formulation of history also played a crucial role in the development of social ideologies of race. Kant, Hegel, and other philosophers of their day claimed that certain racial groups stood outside of history or had no history, and this included all groups that they considered non-white or outside of European ideals of modernity. This meant that groups that were devoid of history and culture were inherently less valuable and therefore subordinate to other races, and they were cast as the natural sacrifices of progress. These assumptions were also codified into law in the 18th and 19th century. The first naturalization laws of the United States in 1790 limited naturalized citizenship to free white persons and excluded other groups. Children born of enslaved mothers were said to inherit the legal statuses of their mother, effectively keeping them in bondage perpetually. And Native Americans were often denied legal property rights, which helped to expedite the process of westward expansion across the North American continent. And anti-miscegenation laws were drafted in order to assure that people from different racial backgrounds did not intermarry or have children in order to protect ideals of racial purity. But these racial categorizations didn't always neatly align with skin tone. In his book, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, historian Matthew Jacobson notes that in the US, white or Caucasian was not always considered a unified race composed of anyone of European descent. Whiteness was often considered exclusive to Anglo-Saxon descendants, while other European groups were broken into different ethnic categories such as Celt, Slavs, Iberics, and Hebrews, which were considered separate races from the 1840s to the early 20th century. But in the 1920s, when there was a stemming of immigration from Europe, these different races were subsumed into one category called whiteness to shore up a cultural majority against other racial groups and immigrants, and this persisted throughout the 20th century. So how does it all add up? Well, race started as a marker of kinship, but then we see it shift to become less about familial inheritance and more focused on physical indicators due to the rise of Enlightenment reasoning and labor exploitation. But where does that leave us today? Well, in the past several decades, scholars have noted both an uptick in identifying with your ethnic history, for example, pride in your country or culture of origin, instead of just being white or Black, but we've also seen a revival of outdated theories of race being biologically determined and attached to certain traits, like considering all people of one physical type as prone to certain behaviors. But regardless of how people identify themselves, race continues to be a complex topic of discussion and debate. With that final thought in mind, do you have any other historical points to add to the evolution of race, and how?
I'm going to stop that there. She talks really fast. I hope that was helpful to begin to unpack the myth of race. what I'd like to do is just keep moving so that we can stay within our time frame. And we want to, as a people of faith, again, to tell a different story. So we're going to watch a succession of videos that speak to that, this myth of race and the birth of racism. And so what happened last year, 2020, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others, my phone and my email blew up because people kept saying, I didn't know that racism still existed, or I thought we took care of this during the civil rights movement, when I had to explain it to them that the movement for people of African descent, Black lives, has always been about resistance, but it also has been a space where those who want to continue to claim white nationalism and that the United States belongs exclusively to people of European descent, that is how we began to have this conversation. And so I'd like for you to journey with me as we look at the legacy of racial injustice.
Black people came to this country after being abducted, kidnapped, and trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean in horrific conditions of confinement. The arrival of chained Africans in 1619 was followed by 2.5 centuries of bondage, violence, degradation, and abusive enslavement. White enslavers created false myths about Black people to justify slavery. Black people were defined as less human, less evolved, less capable, and less worthy of respect. Despite these false ideas of racial difference, enslaved Black people cultivated strategies for survival, fought for freedom, and held on to their dignity and humanity despite the hardships and suffering. When emancipation finally came in 1865, formerly enslaved Black Americans could have sought revenge and retribution against those who had abused them. Instead, most committed themselves to peace, to community, to citizenship, and to a new America. Many Black survivors of slavery were so committed to family that they spent their last resources to find their children, siblings, spouses, and loved ones who had been sold away. By 1867, 80% of Black men had registered to vote. Many ran for office and accepted leadership positions in their community. Education became a priority in the Black community, and Black schools created a generation of skilled citizens who could help the nation grow. But many white leaders were violently resistant to these aspirations for racial equality and citizenship. White mobs attacked Black people and used lynching, violence, and racial terror to prevent Black progress. Congress abandoned Reconstruction in 1877, and the United States Supreme Court sided with former Confederates and white Southerners who declared states' rights to disenfranchise Black people, restore racial hierarchy, and subordinate Black communities. As former New York Governor Horatio Seymour announced, "This is a white man's country, let white men rule." For a century, racial terror lynchings, racist laws, and Jim Crow practices oppressed Black people. When millions fled violence and abuse in the South and moved to the North and West, they faced less risk of mob violence, but continued to see discrimination and bigotry. A heroic civil rights movement emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, led by courageous Black people committed to community and nonviolence. These extraordinary people were beaten and battered. Some were killed, but they dismantled legal apartheid, racial segregation, and legally sanctioned racial hierarchy. While much progress was made, racial discrimination continued, and Black people remained burdened by a destructive presumption of guilt and dangerousness. A new era of mass incarceration emerged. More prisons, more police, and more punishment shaped the end of the 20th century. Today, the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Racial bias is pervasive in the criminal legal system, and the government has projected that 1 in 3 black male babies born is expected to spend time in jail or prison. Long-standing barriers to economic progress, healthcare, and stable housing have been exacerbated by an epidemic of police violence against unarmed black people whose quality of life is measurably disadvantaged and distinct from other Americans. The legacy of slavery and racial injustice still creates barriers to just treatment for some, fosters inequality, and fuels racial animus and bigotry. EJI believes a new era of truth and justice is required that compels our nation to reckon with our history. We believe that truth can set us free and lead to healing, redemption, recovery, and repair. The Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice are dedicated to these goals. These institutions have a purpose. Our hope, our vision, is that the children of our children will live in a nation unburdened by the legacy of slavery, free from racial bigotry and injustice. We hope you'll visit us and join the effort to promote truth and justice in America.
And so Brian Stevenson leaves with us both the history and ways in which we, people of faith, and the Christian church can lean into this promise of justice. Maybe not in our lifetime, but we do have to continue to work toward it. We want to look at the impact of an ideology. You've heard that term ideology tossed around a lot in the last 20, 30 minutes. But this ideology of race on people of African descent also allows us to have a clearer picture of how we are living in this moment and the rise of supremacy, the rise of there was an insurrection on January 6th. And the difference between those who could walk around the Capitol and carry assault weapons, as opposed to those who marched peacefully, or those who were engaged in resistance and protest who did not have weapons, and the treatment was different. There's an ideology that is pervasive still in the United States, and it also is pervasive with people of faith. Want to just we'll look at 2 more videos and then we'll break and have some time for question and answers.
After slavery was prohibited in 1865, formerly enslaved people in America were granted full citizenship, the right to vote, and under the 14th Amendment, protection from racial violence. Formerly enslaved people were promised land and opportunity, but most got nothing because America quickly devolved into an era of racial terrorism and oppression for black citizens. White people in the South were angry that people formerly considered property were now equal citizens. Many turned to violence. In the years immediately following the Civil War, thousands of black people were murdered when they tried to claim their rights. Soon afterwards, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending a brief period of racial progress known as Reconstruction. Nationwide resistance to racial equality resulted in the reestablishment of racial subordination through biased laws, disenfranchisement, and terrorism, most dramatically enforced through lynchings. Racial terror lynchings of black people defined a shameful era in America. These lynchings differed from the hanging of white people in places where there was no functioning criminal justice system. Racial terror lynchings were directed at all black people. They enforced compliance with racial hierarchy and white supremacy, and ensured racial segregation and denial of equal rights. In 1916, in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi, a young black man named Jeff Brown accidentally bumped into a white woman while running to catch a train. A white mob stopped him and lynched him, beating him and then hanging him from a tree for his insolence and carelessness. His public murder was not about criminal punishment, but was instead about maintaining racial hierarchy and terrorizing the black community. White town residents proudly sold photographs of Mr. Brown's brutalized body hanging from the tree for 5 cents each. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented thousands of racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. EJI has confirmed the lynchings of over 4,000 black people who were tortured, maimed, beaten, shot, hung, and burned alive by crowds of white people, often with the cooperation of law enforcement or government officials. The terror of lynching was so widespread that millions of black people fled the South and settled in the urban North and West as refugees of American terror, shaping the current demographic geography of the United States. On July 5, 1933, an older black woman named Elizabeth Lawrence reprimanded a group of white children who threw rocks at her as she walked home from work. Word spread that a black woman had dared to rebuke white children, and that night, an angry mob of white citizens lynched Ms. Lawrence for her audacity. Her home was then burned to the ground. Her son, Alexander, fled to Boston. Racial terror lynchings often had the atmosphere of carnivals, with food vendors and souvenir stands. Hundreds or thousands of white people would often gather to watch and take part in the torture and murder of black citizens. There has been no effort in America to confront this legacy of racial terror. While hundreds of Confederate monuments litter the landscape in southern states, there has been no public recognition of the violence endured by black people. On October 7, 1910, a white mob in Montgomery, Alabama tried to abduct and lynch black men being held in jail on suspicion of miscegenation, or interracial sexual relations. When they were unable to get the men out of the jail, the frustrated mob lynched a black taxi driver named John Dell, who was sitting in his cab nearby. No one was ever arrested or prosecuted for his murder. EJI's Community Remembrance Project collects soil from the many sites where terror lynchings occurred. Jars labeled with the names of murdered black citizens are on public display at EJI, a powerful visual reminder of history we must face. EJI is working to create a permanent memorial to honor victims of lynching, a place to reflect on America's history of racial violence. We hope to place historical markers at hundreds of lynching sites around the country. Contemporary issues like police violence, excessive punishment in the criminal justice system, and even harsh and punitive treatment of children of color in schools and on streets cannot be understood without a deeper examination into our history of racial violence. More truthful discourse and reflection on our history of racial injustice is essential for us to achieve racial equity. Confronting the legacy of lynching is critical to advancing this conversation. We hope you will join our effort to help towns, cities, and states confront and recover from these tragic histories of racial violence through truth and reconciliation, where there can truly be equal justice for all.
Move quickly. And so as we move to the conclusion, I want us to think about how the church engages in political policy, political advocacy, and activism, as well as how we teach our children about this history, but that how it continues to happen in this moment. As many of you may have seen the video where Derek Chauvin has his knee on George Floyd's neck. The look on Chauvin's face is that he would never be punished or incarcerated, and that the life in which he took was not valuable or seen as human. And so we have to also remember that the system, the judicial system in this instance, did punish or did send the notice to the community and the country that we have to right these wrongs. And the church, the United Church of Christ in Minnesota, one of our conferences was very active during that moment. And so we have to recover from our history, and we have to deal with it, and we have to talk about it. So I'm going to move past that. I'm going to go back here. Reverend Tracy Blackman, who is our Associate General Associate General Minister of the United Church of Christ. This is her quote. Race is not real, but racism is real. And so we also have to lean into how we decolonize Christianity and decolonize our Bible. And so when we began to look at the lineage and legacy of Christianity and of Jesus, how we identify the reality of truth telling and how we see and talk about and what we feel about this work has to also be discussed. So that is, we're not going to have time to listen to that one, but I will send the link and some of the resources. And so this is about community learning, the ways in which I train facilitators around a curriculum I created called Sacred Conversations to End Racism is about how we learn in community, not so much about what we think, but how do we feel about what we've learned, about what we've seen, about what we've heard, and then how do we change the narrative so that we can be learning from cultural identities. We look at the history of Asian Americans and Latin Americans and Native Americans and African Americans, but we don't speak for other people groups. We often have those, we invite people from those communities to teach us so that we can learn about solidarity and what it means to move, to lament, and then to move into action. And so this radical faith is around revolutionary love and collective community care. How do we care for humanity, the human family, if we don't see them and value them? How do we change the narrative, this origin of race, that video we saw? How do we begin to understand the narrative around whiteness? And how do we combat white supremacy and the resurgence that's happening in our nation and it's happening globally? And how do we become part of the church, healing the souls of humanity and the church? And so therefore creating strategies of solidarity. And these are some of the resources that I use in my teaching and my own learning. And this is the Africana Bible, reading Israel's scriptures from Africa and the African diaspora. Miguel de la Torre, who teaches at Isla Theological Seminary, has written powerful books. One is Reading the Bible from the Margins, but also Decolonizing Christianity, Becoming Badass Believers. And so we want to also think about, when we talk about settler colonialism and the ways in which the doctrine of discovery has impacted the Christian church, we have to decolonize Christianity. These are some other resources that are helpful to look at. The first 39 books of the Bible are not about Europeans. Jesus is not a white male. So we have to dig into the very movement, of people in that particular region, Africans in Africa, and the Africans in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how we listen to people of diverse cultures and the ways in which they understand theology and Christology. And so this is another Wilda Gaffney, who has talked about white supremacy in the Bible, has written 2 lectionaries for the church to lean into. She's a womanist scholar, she's a Hebrew Bible scholar, and these are important for us if we're going to be preaching and teaching and moving our children in a different direction. We have to have the resources. We have to educate ourselves or re-educate ourselves, expand our language, our knowledge, our history, and then we have to have a more inclusive set of resources in order to have a different conversation within the body of Christ. And so this is the campaign that I am leading through the United Church of Christ, Join the Movement Toward Racial Justice. This allows us to demonstrate God's love, to partner with others, and to work for the common good. We are people of the church. The church are the people. And so this movement, again, began with those first disciples. And so how do we live into the mandate to work and seek justice, love, and compassion? And so the invitation is also your invitation to join the movement. And you can go to our website. And so I want to conclude here, stop sharing. there's always much to learn and much to lean into. And so I want to make space for you to engage at this time, to ask questions, to talk about what you've seen and what you heard and what you've learned and how this impacts our faith, how it impacts the church. And what does it mean in this moment as we move forward from today, what we take with us, so that we can begin to have a conversation with our community, our churches, about the ways in which people of African descent have been seen and labeled, the ways in which racial terrorism is a reality, that it did not end during emancipation, and that what we witness, the real witness of how we continue to see these bodies, Black bodies on the ground, Black bodies, and I call it a lynching. And when I speak of lynching, I'm speaking of this spectacle. And I want us to go back to Golgotha. That was a lynching. That was a lynching. To display the body of Jesus was a lesson for those who went against the empire. How do we use that story? How do we understand the liberation and the justice and the love that Jesus sought to have with us? It's important that we begin to have these conversations because, again, it's all of our history, but we can reclaim it, redeem it, we can talk about it. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. I welcome any questions that you have or comments.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Love. Such powerful words and for sharing this powerful message. We do have some questions that have come in during the presentation. I'll go ahead and share the first one. The first question is, we socially and theologically still use Enlightenment thought as foundational. I think of Reformation and the Reformed traditions. Could you share some thoughts on this?
So yes, we still use language. And so we have, in the United Church of Christ, we have 4 traditions. The Reformed tradition really is still out of a European ideology. But how do we then lean into and listen to, because what happens even during the Reformation, that enslavement is going on, right? And genocide is happening. So what about the faith of the people who are enslaved, the faith of the people that stewarded this land? The Reformation does not free us from this ideology. It really does hold in place this sense of European identity in our Christian churches. And so we have to lean into those cultural narratives. When I ask people to go back and get their own history, now that I have my own DNA, I talk about Western cosmology. How do I understand my own people's faith, what they believed, what they were restricted from practicing because those Europeans thought it was demonic, when it was actually these people of African descent had a richer and larger understanding of who God is and who God was for them. And so we do have to reform even the Reformation. So thank you for the question.
Amen to that. The second question is, you are speaking to a people, Mennonites, who often try to distance themselves from the history of the land in which they enjoy the privilege of whiteness. How do we unveil this hypocrisy?
You unveil it by doing your work. I encourage you, even as a Mennonite, that you go back and get the very history that I shared with you today. And again, ask that question. If it's the Mennonites within the United States context, I would say, who are your people? Where did they come from? What beliefs did they come with? And the faith beliefs that you have must be broken open. God is not monolithic. God is not small. God is huge. And what have you dig more deeply into the history, to face the history, to talk about the history, because it also means that it is living today. And the Christian church, if it does not reform itself, talk about the ways in which this history still is lived out today. You know, how did yes, how did you become the steward of the land that belonged to other people? You have to look at that. Where are the people that stewarded the land? Where are those Native American tribes? Where are they? Do you know any? How do you reconcile that? And so those are questions. I don't have answers for everything. I have more questions, and I would encourage you to do that work as well.
Yes, do that work and seek those answers. Yes, I especially loved what you said early on. If we're going to tell the truth, we have to go back and get it.
Yeah,
that's so true. Another question that we have is they would like to hear how the church's theologies and doctrines did and continue to support white supremacy, and how we can deconstruct those to liberating mystical understandings of God, relationships, creation, and redemption, for instance.
So I'm not sure if you have had an opportunity to read Mark Charles' book, Unsettling Truths and the Legacy of Doctrine of Discovery. I would lean into that. Also, Walter Brueggemann has written a fantastic book called Tenacious Solidarity, and he talks about white supremacism in our Christian faith and where that comes from. He unpacks and decolonizes that for us. It is important, again, that we do our work. We have to do our work, and we also have to talk about, when we talk about the doctrine of discovery, it's lived, it is still embedded in the church. There are churches on the East Coast and around the country, but when I think about Virginia and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Connecticut, those churches are wealthy beyond belief because they owned my ancestors. And the wealth that came from those owning ancestors, owning the land, and also not telling the truth about the ownership of the land means that they have to also talk about repair and reparations, because the 200, 300 years of unpaid labor means that the wealth of the nation is off of the back of the African and the Native American. And so that is how we begin to unpack. And if you listen to any of Mark Charles's YouTube videos, he talks about the United States Constitution is a racist document, and that all of that document was not about unity. It was about white land-owning men from Europe that settled in North America and the colonies. And so he is the one who is best to tell that story.
Yes, Mark Charles is amazing. And for those joining us that haven't, that this is your first webinar joining, we actually had Mark Charles speak as a part of the first webinar that we had this year. So that is available on the MCC website if you want to go back and take a look at that, or any of the resources that Dr. Love is sharing here today. We do have another question that I see here. Speaking as a, and this is a question that I'm reading, speaking as a white Hispanic, I am curious to know if Dr. Love can draw any connections between racism against Hispanics and racism against African and African Americans.
It's dangerous to compare racist behavior. And so if you're Hispanic and you claim whiteness, then you would need to go back and look at your Spanish ancestry and look at the ways in which the Spanish colonized and also terrorized the continent, as well as those native lands in the Southern Hemisphere. Again, it is a way of moving toward whiteness means that you're more acceptable. And so what does it mean to be Hispanic? What is that? Who are your original people groups, and when were they dominated by the Spanish or the Europeans? And so we have to have a deeper understanding of the complexity of the relationship between peoples, because there were many Mexicans who denied Africans were enslaved. There were Latin Americans who denied that they had ancestry, African ancestry. And there were Native Americans who married African and some of my African ancestors, and that is why that DNA is in my blood. But if you were Black, considered Black, or of African descent, and you wanted to claim your identity closer to whiteness, then that's the identity that you moved toward. And so what does it mean to claim a different kind of identity so that you can have solidarity with other people of Hispanic heritage that are working at the level of movement toward resistance and justice?
Yes, yes, so very true. I'm not seeing any more questions, but I'm actually wondering. I especially love how deliberate and intentional you were in opening up this space to really ground ourselves in what is pre-human history, and how do we recover our individual histories, and how do we piece that together again. And this webinar is a result of it's been an accompaniment to a year-long book study that's been happening with Jamar Tisby's Color of Compromise book. And so as we are closing out this season, we're moving towards action. And so I'm curious to hear more about how does this recovering of history and the wealth of culture and knowledge and alternative forms of knowledge that are there, how does that inform the ways that you imagine future possibilities, imagine a more peaceful world and things outside of the systems that we have now, which are so embedded with the legacies of all this violence?
Yes, thank you so much, Daniela. This is a great question. Part of the answer really is, or part of the leaning is, how do we recover and how do we repair? It is looking at all of what you have just outlined. It's a lot of work to move from this space of going back and then coming forward. When we think about the policies that were created, how do we lean into understanding better right now? I just read yesterday where Stacey Abrams is getting ready to run for governor in Alabama. It's Alabama, Georgia. And so what does it mean as people of faith to understand and then to join that movement? What does it mean in this moment that militarism is still very much a part of the goal tied to capitalism? How do we have hope if the Christian church is not raising these issues of public policy, of government policy, and of empire? And where do we find our global solidarity partners who are doing this work of repair and reparatory justice? And so we have to be in conversation. We have to do this in community. And many of my colleagues, and even myself, I'm thinking that, people of African descent, Latinx descent, Native descent, we did not build this nation. We did not construct the laws. And so I'm hoping that those of European descent who are part of the church are more active in the dismantling of racism, more active in the dismantling of the policies, and out there on the front lines, both protecting and protesting. If that doesn't happen, then that means that the status quo is okay, that fear is living within the body or the local church or wherever you are sitting, and God does not, I believe that God is larger than our fears. If it were not for Fannie Lou Hamer, if it were not for Harriet Tubman, if it were not for John Lewis, if it were not for Stacey Abrams, if it were not for those right now in this movement who are pushing back, where would we be? And so get out there, do your work, understand the policies within your city, your state, all all of the spaces that you inhabit. And even if you're in a rural or small town, there is something that you can do in terms of using your voice, if not your body. Daniela, is that sufficient? Was that the question?
Oh, yes. Yes. Yes, plenty. Plenty. And I want to say also, I just appreciate so much the way that you have been resourcing us throughout this entire presentation as well, and in your responses. And we will be sure to be posting those as well as they come up. I am seeing more questions rolling in. Here we go. You mentioned the rich churches along the eastern seaboard that became rich off the backs of tax-free slavery, etc. What needs to happen to have these comfortable people who go on about their daily lives without thinking about their history? What needs to happen to change their comfort and knowledge levels?
Thank you. Great question. So I would say that a church in the vicinity of those very wealthy churches would reach out and begin to have a conversation, to use perhaps the color of compromise, to have more than just reading books, but it is a conversation and a relationship, to do the history of that church. When did the church come into existence? How did it get its resources? Who's responsible for holding on to the resources? And then what does it mean to repair or reparatory justice? And so I think when churches go about their daily lives, they're comfortable. They vote in their self-interest. And so if it is a self-interest or a person that's running that is a proponent of enslavement, and when I mean enslavement, incarceration, then one has to say, well, did you know that this law exists in your city, that your church voted in this particular way? As a student at North Park Theological Seminary, those were evangelicals. They voted overwhelmingly for Trump in the first election and overwhelmingly in the second election. My conversation with them in the first election is that this is going to set us back. Those of us who have been working against the very rise of white nationalism and supremacy, this is going to set us back, because what we're hearing is the rhetoric that this nation belongs to white folk. And so, how do we then engage with people? It doesn't have to be combative, but we should be equipped with the knowledge of the land, of the history, and then to be in conversation with people. Now, I want to be clear. I'm a believer in Jesus. I'm also a believer that not everybody is going to get on board. I'm a believer in that some people want to side with the empire. I'm also a believer that people want to hold on to their guns. I believe that we will continue to have this fight, but I also have hope that the church can be that voice that stands up and says, we are going to educate, we're going to start different kinds of cultural schools, we're going to work for racial equity, for voting rights. We're going to do this. The world needs to know that the Christian church is not dead, and that it is alive and it believes.
That is inspiring talk. What else do we have? Let me see. Can you share success stories from your experience with white folks within the UCC movement? Moving from racist, I'm sorry, this question, let me rephrase this. Let me say it again. Can you share success stories from your experience of white folks within UCC? Moving from racist realities to joining the anti-racist struggles, what stories had the most impact in breaking down the blinders put up by culture and white powers?
Yes. So I started it in 2017 as the Racial Minister for Racial Justice. I created a curriculum out of African-centered pedagogy. United Church of Christ has been a champion of being part of a political process, a social process, a Christian process. What I wanted to bring to this was the voices of those who had been silenced for decades, for centuries. The curriculum demands that we ingest what we have read and heard and learned. It also means that we interrogate what we hear, that we read differently, we listen differently. We cannot think ourselves out of where we are today. We have to feel it in our bodies. We have to feel this work in our bodies. And I've trained about 42 folks that have been certified to become facilitators of the curriculum. And the story is that they feel like this is a radical reversal of everything they've ever learned. It is getting to the core of who we are as God's people, that it is that radical Jesus that we believe in, who was about the liberation and equity of people. It is about God's liberation and equity. It is about the way in which we see people. How do we see people? How do we experience people? Because people's stories of how they experience the world matters. And so those that have been trained of European descent that are on this journey have created their own modules. They are teaching others. They are going on to lead workshops. They are also encouraging other people of European descent in Arizona, in Texas, and in Colorado, all across the country, that we have to follow this radical teaching, that we have to get out of our heads, that we have to expand our understanding of theologies, womanist, Marista, Asian. We have to listen to those theologies, our Christologies, our cultural Christologies. And so we have to lean into that. And so when people of European descent do their work, I don't do it for them. When they do their work and they uncover what they haven't learned, and then they lean into the ways in which they can do church and be church differently, and we do it in community so that we're listening to one another. We make mistakes together. We change our language together, and then we support one another. That's a solidarity movement. And that is how we do this work. And that's the story that stays with me. These amazing people that came with their own understanding, and now they're radicalized, and they will change the church in their own spaces. And then when we come together, we will change it together.
Amen. Amen. I love that. Wow, such incredible questions as well. Thank you to everyone that took the time to write in. We are coming up to the top of our end of our time. Dr. Love, I can't thank you enough for your time today and for your words and for the challenge and all of the questions that you're providing. I think a lot of the conversation around especially during the season has been, what's next? What do we do next? And you've just provided so much reflection and so much work that's still to be done within ourselves and within our context. So I really appreciate that.